Step into the Miasma Ward. In 1839, doctors thought the bad air of towns like Isabel was the primary pathogen. In Chapter 5, we've descended from the Mico and landed in a biological pressure cooker. Before we assess the local infection, verify your rotation, subscribe, and authorize the intake like. I'm also monitoring the quarantine stations in the comments. Where is the global squad tuning in from as the temperature rises? We are opening the Isabel files. As a medical student, I find the pre-vector logic here fascinating. Stephens describes the sickly air of the town, but we know the real threat is buzzing in the shadows. It's a study in environmental stress. The mountain broke their muscles. The town is going to test their immune systems. Stay cool. The air is heavy and the fever is close. Let's open the file.
Chapter 5.
Turning away from the church, we passed the brow of a hill, behind which was a collection of huts almost concealed from sight and occupied by our friends of the night before. Very soon we commenced ascending a mountain. At a short distance we met a corpse borne on a rude bier sticks, upon the shoulders of Indians, naked except a piece of cotton cloth over the loins, and shaking awfully under the movements of its carriers. Soon after we met another, borne the same way, but wrapped in matting, and accompanied by 3 or 4 men and a young woman. Both were on their way to the graveyard of the village church. Ascending, we reached the top of a mountain and saw behind us a beautiful valley extending toward Jacotin, but all waste, and suggesting a feeling of regret that so beautiful a country should be in such miserable hands. At 12:30 we descended to the banks of the Copan River. It was broad and rapid, and in the middle was a large sandbar. We had difficulty in fording it, and some of the baggage, particularly the beds and bedding, got wet. From the opposite side, we again commenced ascending another ridge, and from the top saw the river winding through the valley. As we crossed, by a sudden turn it flowed along the base, and we looked directly down upon it. Descending this mountain, we came to a beautiful stream, where a gray-haired Indian woman and a pretty little girl, pictures of youth and old age, were washing clothes. We dismounted and sat down on the bank to wait for the muleteer. I forgot to mention that he had with him a boy about 13 or 14 years old, a fine little fellow, upon whom he imposed the worst part of the burden, that of chasing the mules, and who really seemed like Baron Munchausen's dog, in danger of running his legs off. Our breach with the muleteer had not been healed, and at first we ascribed to him some agency in our troubles at Comotan. At all events, if it had not been for him, we should not have stopped there. All day he had been particularly furious with the mules, and they had been particularly perverse, and now they had gone astray, and it was an hour before we heard his spiteful voice loading them with curses. We mounted again, and at 4 o'clock saw at a distance a hacienda on the opposite side of a valley. It stood alone, and promised a quiet resting place for the night. We turned off from the Camino Real into a wild path, stony and overgrown with bushes, and so steep that we were obliged to dismount, let the mules go ahead, and hold on ourselves by the bushes to descend. At the foot of the hill we mounted and crossed a stream, where a little boy, playing in the water, saluted me by crossing his arms upon his breast, and then passed on to Mr. Catherwood. This was a favorable omen, and as we climbed up a steep hill, I felt that here, in this lovely spot, away from the gathering places of men, we must meet kindness. On the top of the hill a woman, with a naked child in her arms and a smile on her face, stood watching our toilsome ascent. and when we asked her if we could make posada or lodge there, she answered in the kindest phrase of the country, with a face that spoke even a warmer welcome than her words. Como no? Why not? And when she saw that our servant had pineapples in his alforjas, she asked why he brought them, and if he did not know that she had plenty. The situation of the hacienda of San Antonio was wildly beautiful. It had a clearing for a cow yard, a plantation of corn, tobacco, and plantains, and the opening gave a view of the high mountains by which it was surrounded. The house was built of poles plastered with mud, and against the wall in front of the door was a figure of the Savior on the cross, on a white cotton cloth hung round with votive offerings. The naked child which the mother carried in her arms was called Maria de Los Angeles. While supper was in preparation, the master of the house arrived, a swarthy, grim-looking fellow, with a broad-brimmed sombrero and huge whiskers, and mounted on a powerful young horse, which he was just breaking to the mountain roads. When he knew that we were strangers asking hospitality, his harsh features relaxed, and he repeated the welcome the woman had given us.
Unfortunately, the boy of the muleteer was taken very ill. His master paid no attention to him, and while the poor little fellow was groaning under a violent fever, ate on with perfect indifference. We made him a comfortable bed on the piazza, and Mr. Catherwood gave him a dose of medicine. Our evening passed very differently from the last. Our host and hostess were a kind-hearted and simple couple. It was the first time they had ever met with men from another country, and they asked many questions and examined our little traveling apparatus, particularly our plated cups, knives, forks, and spoons. We showed them our watcher compass, sextant, chronometer, thermometer, telescope, and sea. And the woman, with great discernment, said that we must be very rich and had muchos ideas, many ideas. They asked us about our wives, and we learned that our simple-minded host had two, one of whom lived at Hocotan, and that he passed a week alternately with each. We told him that in England he would be transported, and in the north imprisoned for life for such indulgences, to which he responded that they were barbarous countries. And the woman, although she thought a man ought to be content with one, said that it was no pecado or crime to have two. But I heard them say sotto voce that we were más cristianos, or better Christians than they. He assisted us in swinging our hammocks, and about 9 o'clock we drove out the dogs and pigs, lighted cigars, and went to bed. Including servants, women, and children, we numbered 11 in the room. All around were little balls of fire, shining and disappearing with the puffs of the cigars. One by one these went out and we fell asleep. In the morning we all rose together. The boy was much better, but we did not think him in a condition to travel. His brutal master, however, insisted upon his going. For all that our kind friends had done for us, they would have charged us nothing. But besides compensating them in money, we distributed among them various trifles. And when bidding them farewell, I saw with regret a ring which I had given her sparkling on his finger. After we had mounted, the little boy whom we had met at the stream came staggering under a load of 6 freshly cut pineapples. And even when we had started, the woman ran after me with a piece of fresh sugar cane. All parted at the hacienda of San Antonio with kind feelings except our surly muleteer, who was indignant, as he said, that we made presents to everybody except to him. The poor boy was most grateful, but unfortunately for him, we had given him a knife, which made the muleteer jealous. Almost immediately from the hacienda we entered a thick wood, dense as that of the Mico mountain, and almost as muddy. The ascent was toilsome, but the top was open and so covered with that beautiful plant that we called it the mountain of aloes. Some were just peeping out of the ground, others were 20 or 30 feet high, and some gigantic stalks were dead. flowers which would have kindled rapture in the breast of beauty, had bloomed and died on this desolate mountain, unseen except by a passing Indian. In descending we lost the path and wandered for some time before we recovered it. Almost immediately we commenced ascending another mountain, and from its top looked completely over a third, and at a great distance saw a large hacienda. Our road lay directly along the edge of a precipice, from which we looked down upon the tops of gigantic pines at a great distance beneath us. Very soon the path became so broken, and ran so near the edge of a precipice, that I called to Mr. Catherwood to dismount. The precipice was on the left side, and I had advanced so far that, on the back of a perverse mule, I did not venture to make any irregular movement, and rode for some moments in great anxiety. Somewhere on this road, but unmarked by any visible sign, we crossed the boundary line of the state of Guatemala and entered Honduras. At 2 o'clock we reached the village of Copan, which consisted of half a dozen miserable huts thatched with corn. Our appearance created a great sensation. All the men and women gathered around us to gaze. We inquired immediately for the ruins, but none of the villagers could direct us to them, and all advised us to go to the hacienda of Don Gregorio. We had no wish to stop at a village and told the muleteer to go on, but he refused and said that his engagement was to conduct us to Copan. After a long wrangle we prevailed, and riding through a coppice forded once more the Copan River, and came out upon a clearing, on one side of which was a hacienda with a tile roof, and having cocina and other outbuildings, evidently the residence of a rich proprietor. We were greeted by a pack of barking dogs, and all the doorways were filled with women and children, who seemed in no small degree surprised at our appearance. There was not a man in sight, but the women received us kindly and told us that Don Gregorio would return soon, and would conduct us to the ruins. Immediately the fire was rekindled in the cocina. The sound of the patting of hands gave notice of the making of tortillas, and in half an hour dinner was ready. It was served up on a massive silver plate, with water in a silver tankard, but without knife, fork, or spoon. Soup or caldo was served in cups to be drunk. Nevertheless, we congratulated ourselves upon having fallen into such good quarters.
In a short time a young man arrived on horseback, gaily dressed, with an embroidered shirt, and accompanied by several men driving a herd of cattle. An ox was selected, a rope thrown around its horns, and the animal was drawn up the side of the house, and, by another rope round its legs, thrown down. Its feet were tied together, its head drawn back by a rope tied from its horns to its tail, and with one thrust of the machete the artery of life was severed. The pack of hungry dogs stood ready, and with a horrible clicking, lapped up the blood with their tongues. All the women were looking on, and a young girl took a puppy dog and rubbed its nose in the crimson stream. To give it early a taste for blood, the ox was skinned, the meat separated from the bones, and to the entire destruction of steaks, sirloins, and roasting pieces, in an hour the whole animal was hanging in long strings on a line before the door. During this operation Don Gregorio arrived. He was about 50, had large black whiskers, and a beard of several days' growth, and from the behavior of all around, it was easy to see that he was a domestic tyrant. The glance which he threw at us before dismounting seemed to say, "Who are you?" But without a word, he entered the house. We waited until he had finished his dinner, when, supposing that to be the favorable moment, I entered the house. In my intercourse with the world, I have more than once found my overtures to an acquaintance received coldly, but I never experienced anything quite so cool as the Don's reception of me. I told him that we had come into that neighborhood to visit the ruins of Copan, and his manner said, "What's that to me?" But he answered that they were on the other side of the river. I asked him whether we could procure a guide, and again he said that the only man who knew anything about them lived on the other side of the river. As yet, we did not make sufficient allowance for the distracted state of the country, nor the circumstance that a man might incur danger to himself by giving shelter to suspected persons. But relying on the reputation of the country for hospitality, and the proof of it which we had already met with, I was rather slow in coming to the disagreeable conclusion that we were not welcome. This conclusion, however, was irresistible. The Don was not pleased with our looks. I ordered the muleteer to saddle the mules, but the rascal enjoyed our confusion, and positively refused to saddle his beast again that day. We applied to Don Gregorio himself, offering to pay him, and as Augustine said in the hope of getting rid of us, he lent us two on which to ride back to the village. Unfortunately, the guide we sought was away. A brisk cockfight was then pending, and we received no encouragement, either from the appearance of the people or from invitation, to bring back our luggage to that place. And we learned, what was very provoking, that Don Gregorio was a great man of Copan, the richest man and the petty tyrant, and that it would be most unfortunate to have a rupture with him, or even to let it be known at the village that we were not well received at his house. Reluctantly, but in the hope of making a more favorable impression, we returned to the hacienda, Mr. C., dismounted on the steps, and took a seat on the piazza. I happened to dismount outside, and before moving, took a survey of the party. The Don sat on a chair, with our detestable muleteer by his side, and a half-concealed smile of derision on his face, talking of idols, and looking at me. By this time 8 or 10 men, sons, servants, and laborers, had come in from their day's work, but not one offered to take my mule, or made any of those demonstrations of civility which are always shown to a welcome guest. The women turned away their heads, as if they had been reproved for receiving us, and all the men, taking their cue from the Don, looked so insulting that I told Mr. Catherwood we would tumble our luggage into the road and curse him for an inhospitable churl. But Mr. Catherwood warned me against it, urging that, if we had an open quarrel with him, after all our trouble, we would be prevented seeing the ruins. The Don probably suspected something of what passed, and, fearing that he might push things too far and bring a stain upon his name, pointed to a chair and asked me to take a seat. With a great effort, I resolved to smother my indignation until I could pour it out with safety. Augustine was very indignant at the treatment we received. On the road he had sometimes swelled his own importance by telling the flags hoisted and cannon fired when we left Balize, and here he hoisted more flags and fired more guns than usual, beginning with 40 guns, and afterwards going on to a cannonade. But it would not do. The Don did not like us, and probably was willing to hoist flags and fire cannons too, as at Balize, when we should go away.
Toward evening the skin of an ox was spread upon the piazza, corn and ears thrown upon it, and all the men with the Don at their head sat down to shell it. The cobs were carried to the kitchen to burn, the corn taken up in baskets, and 3 pet hogs which had been grunting outside in expectation of the feast, were let in to pick up the scattered grains. During the evening no notice was taken of us, except that the wife of the Don sent a message by Augustine that supper was preparing, and our wounded pride was relieved and our discontent somewhat removed by an additional message that they had an oven and flour, and would bake us some bread if we wished to buy it. After supper all prepared for sleep. The Don's house had 2 sides, an inside and an out. The Don and his family occupied the former and we the latter. but we had not even this to ourselves. All along the wall were frames made of sticks about an inch thick, tied together with bark strings, over which the workmen spread an untanned oxhide for a bed. There were 3 hammocks besides ours, and I had so little room for mine that my body described an inverted parabola, with my heels as high as my head. It was vexatious and ridiculous, or, in the words of the English tourist in Fra Diavolo, it was shocking. Positively shocking. In the morning Don Gregorio was in the same humor. We took no notice of him, but made our toilet under the shed with as much respect as possible to the presence of the female members of the family, who were constantly passing and repassing. We had made up our minds to hold on and see the ruins, and fortunately early in the morning one of the crusty Don's sons, a civil young man, brought over from the village Jose, the guide of whom we stood in need. By reason of many vexatious delays, growing out of difficulties between Jose and the muleteer, we did not get away until 9 o'clock. Very soon we left the path or road and entered a large field, partially cultivated with corn belonging to Don Gregorio. Riding some distance through this, we reached a hut, thatched with corn leaves on the edge of the woods, at which some workmen were preparing their breakfast. Here we dismounted, and tying our mules to trees nearby, entered the woods, Jose clearing a path before us with a machete. Soon we came to the bank of a river and saw directly opposite a stone wall, perhaps 60 feet high, with trees growing out of the top, running north and south along the river, in some places fallen but in others entire. It had more the character of a structure than any we had ever seen ascribed to the aborigine of America, and formed part of the Wall of Copan, an ancient city on whose history books throw but little light. I am entering abruptly upon new ground. Volumes without number have been written to account for the first peopling of America. By some the inhabitants of this continent have been regarded as a separate race, not descended from the same common father with the rest of mankind. Others have ascribed their origin to some remnant of the antediluvian inhabitants of the earth, who survived the deluge which swept away the greatest part of the human species in the days of Noah, and hence have considered them the most ancient race of people on the earth. Under the broad range allowed by a descent from the sons of Noah, the Jews, the Canaanites, the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, the Greeks, the Scythians in ancient times, the Chinese, the Swedes, the Norwegians, the Welsh, and the Spaniards in modern, have had ascribed to them the honor of peopling America. The 2 continents have been joined together and rent asunder by the shock of an earthquake. The fabled island of Atlantis has been lifted out of the ocean, and not to be behindhand, an enterprising American has turned the tables on the old world, and planted the ark itself within the state of New York. The monuments and architectural remains of the aborigines have heretofore formed but little part of the groundwork for these speculations. Dr. Robertson, in his History of America, lays it down as a certain principle that America was not peopled by any nation of the ancient continent which had made considerable progress in civilization. The inhabitants of the New World, he says, were in a state of society so extremely rude as to be unacquainted with those arts which are the first essays of human ingenuity in its advance toward improvement. Discrediting the glowing accounts of Cortés and his companions, of soldiers, priests, and civilians, all concurring in representations of the splendor exhibited in the buildings of Mexico, he says that the houses of the people were mere huts, built with turf or mud, or the branches of trees, like those of the rudest Indians. The temple of Cholula was nothing more than a mound of earth, without any steps or any facing of stone, covered with grass and shrubs, and on the authority of persons long resident in New Spain, and who professed to have visited every part of it, he says that, There is not, in all the extent of that vast empire, a single monument or vestige of any building more ancient than the conquest. At that time, distrust was perhaps the safer side for the historian, but since Dr. Robertson wrote, a new flood of light has poured upon the world, and the field of American antiquities has been opened.
The ignorance, carelessness, and indifference of the inhabitants of Spanish America on this subject are matters of wonder. In the United States, the opening of forests and the discovery of tumuli or mounds and fortifications, extending in ranges from the lakes through the valleys of the Ohio and Mississippi, mummies in a cave in Kentucky, the inscription on a rock at Dighton, and the ruins of walls in a great city in Arkansas and Wisconsin Territory, had suggested wild and wandering ideas in regard to the first peopling of this country, and the strong belief that powerful and populous nations had occupied it and had passed away, whose histories are entirely unknown. The same evidences continue in Texas, and in Mexico they assume a still more definite form. The first new light thrown upon this subject as regards Mexico was by the great Humboldt, who visited that country at a time when, by the jealous policy of the government, it was almost as much closed against strangers as China is now. No man could have better deserved such fortune. At that time, the monuments of the country were not a leading object of research, but Humboldt collected from various sources information and drawings, particularly of Mitla or the Vale of the Dead, Xochicalco, a mountain hewed down and terraced, and called the Hill of Flowers, and the great pyramid or temple at Churlish he visited himself, of all which his own eloquent account is within reach of the reader. Unfortunately, of the great cities beyond the Vale of Mexico, buried in forests, ruined, desolate, and without a name, Humboldt never heard, or at least he never visited them. It is but lately that accounts of their existence reached Europe and the United States. These accounts, however vague and unsatisfactory, had roused our curiosity and were the object of our journey, though I ought perhaps to say that both Mr. C. and I were somewhat skeptical, and when we arrived at Copan, it was with the hope, rather than the expectation, of finding wonders. Since the discovery of these ruined cities, the prevailing theory has been that they belong to a race long anterior to that which inhabited the country at the time of the Spanish conquest. With regard to Copan, mention is made by the early Spanish historians of a place of that name, situated in the same region of country in which these ruins are found, which then existed as an inhabited city, and offered a formidable resistance to the Spanish arms, though there are circumstances which seem to indicate that the city referred to was inferior in strength and solidity of construction and of more modern origin. It stood in the old province of Chiquimula de la Sierra, which was conquered by the officers of Pedro de Alvarado, but not one of the Spanish historians has given any particulars of this conquest. In 1530, the Indians of the province revolted and attempted to throw off the yoke of Spain. Hernandez de Chavez was sent to subdue them, and, after many sanguinary battles, he encamped before Esquipulas, a place of arms belonging to a powerful cacique, which, on the fourth day, to use the words of cacique himself, more out of respect to the public tranquillity than from fear of the Spanish arms, determined to surrender, and, with the capital, the whole province submitted again to the Spanish dominion.
The cacique of Copan, whose name was Copan Cowell, had been active in exciting the revolt and assisting the insurgents. Hernandez de Chavez determined to punish him, and marched against Copan, then one of the largest, most opulent, and most populous places of the kingdom. The camp of the cacique, with his auxiliaries, consisted of 30,000 men, well disciplined and veterans in war, armed with wooden swords having stone edges, arrows, and slings. On one side, says the historian, it was defended by the ranges of mountains of Chiquimula and Gracios a Dios, and on the opposite side by a deep fosse, and an entrenchment formed of strong beams of timber, having the interstices filled with earth, with embrasures and loopholes for the discharge of arrows. Chavez, accompanied by some horsemen well armed, rode to the fosse, and made sign that he wished to hold a conference. The cacique answered with an arrow. A shower of arrows, stones, and darts followed, which compelled the Spaniards to retreat. The next day Chavez made an attack upon the entrenchment. The infantry wore loose coats stuffed with cotton, swords, and shields. The horsemen wore breastplates and helmets, and their horses were covered. The Copans had each a shield covered with the skin of the Danta on his arm, and his head guarded by bunches of feathers. The attack lasted the whole day. The Indians, with their arrows, javelins, and pikes, the heads of which were hardened by fire, maintained their ground. The Spaniards were obliged to retreat. Chavez, who had fought in the thickest of the battle, was alarmed at the difficulties of the enterprise and the danger to the credit of the Spanish arms, but received information that in one place the depth of the ditch which defended Copan was but trifling, and the next day he proceeded to the spot to make an attack there. The Copans had watched his movements and manned the entrenchment with their bravest soldiers. The infantry were unable to make a lodgment. The cavalry came to their assistance. The Indians brought up their whole force, and the Spaniards stood like rocks, impassable to pikes, arrows, and stones. Several times they attempted to scale the entrenchments and were driven back into the fosse. Many were killed on both sides, but the battle continued without advantage to either, until a brave horseman leaped the ditch, and his horse being carried violently with his breast against the barrier, the earth and palisadoes gave way, and the frightened horde plunged among the Indians. Other horsemen followed and spread such terror among the Copans that their lines were broken and they fled. Copan Callel rallied at a place where he had posted a body of reserve, but unable to resist long retreated and left Copan to its fate. This is the account which the Spanish historians have given of Copan, and as applied to the city, the wall of which we saw from the opposite side of the river, it appeared to us most meager and unsatisfactory, for the massive stone structures before us had little the air of belonging to a city, the entrenchment of which could be broken down by the charge of a single horseman. At this place the river was not fordable. We returned to our mules, mounted, and rode to another part of the bank a short distance above. The stream was wide and in some places deep, rapid, and with a broken and stony bottom. Fording it, we rode along the bank by a footpath encumbered with undergrowth, which José opened by cutting away the branches, until we came to the foot of the wall, where we again dismounted and tied our mules.
The wall was of cut stone, well laid, and in a good state of preservation. We ascended by large stone steps, in some places perfect, and in others thrown down by trees which had grown up between the crevices, and reached a terrace, the form of which it was impossible to make out from the density of the forest in which it was enveloped. Our guide cleared away with his machete, and we passed, as it lay half buried in the earth, a large fragment of stone elaborately sculptured, and came to the angle of a structure with steps on the sides, in form and appearance, so far as the trees would enable us to make it out like the sides of a pyramid. Diverging from the base, and working our way through the thick woods, we came upon a square stone column, about 14 feet high, and 3 feet on each side sculptured in very bold relief, and on all 4 of the sides, from the base to the top. The front was the figure of a man, curiously and richly dressed, and the face, evidently a portrait, solemn, stern, and well fitted to excite terror. The back was of a different design, unlike anything we had ever seen before, and the sides were covered with hieroglyphics. This our guide called an idol. And before it, at a distance of 3 feet, was a large block of stone, also sculptured with figures and emblematical devices, which he called an altar. The sight of this unexpected monument put at rest at once, and forever in our minds, all uncertainty in regard to character of American antiquities, and gave us the assurance that the objects we were in search of were interesting, not only as the remains of an unknown people, but as works of art, proving, like newly discovered historical records, that the people who once occupied the continent of America were not savages, with an interest perhaps stronger than we had ever felt in wandering among the ruins of Egypt. We followed our guide, who, sometimes missing his way, with a constant and vigorous use of his machete, conducted us through the thick forest, among half-buried fragments, to 14 monuments of the same character and appearance, some with more elegant designs, and some in workmanship equal to the finest monuments of the Egyptians. One displaced from its pedestal by enormous roots, another locked in the close embrace of branches of trees and almost lifted out of the earth, another hurled to ground and bound down by huge vines and creepers, and one standing, with its altar before it, in a grove of trees which grew around it, seemingly to shade and shroud it as a sacred thing. In the solemn stillness of the woods, it seemed a divinity mourning over a fallen people. The only sounds that disturbed the quiet of this buried city were the noise of monkeys moving among the tops of the trees, and the cracking of dry branches broken by their weight. They moved over our heads in long and swift processions, 40 or 50 at a time, some with little ones wound in their long arms, walking out to the end of boughs, and holding on with their hind feet or a curl of the tail, sprang to a branch of the next tree, and, with a noise like a current of wind, passed on into the depths of the forest. It was the first time we had seen these mockeries of humanity, and, with the strange monuments around us, they seemed like wandering spirits of the departed race guarding the ruins of their former habitations. We returned to the base of the pyramidal structure and ascended by regular stone steps, in some places forced apart by bushes and saplings, and in others thrown down by the growth of large trees, while some remained entire. In parts they were ornamented with sculptured figures and rows of death's heads. Climbing over the ruined top, we reached a terrace overgrown with trees, and, crossing it, descended by stone steps into an area so covered with trees that at first we could not make out its form, but which, on clearing the way with a machete, we ascertained to be a square, and with steps on all the sides almost as perfect as those of the Roman amphitheater. The steps were ornamented with sculpture, and on the south side, about halfway up, forced out of its place by roots, was a colossal head, evidently a portrait. We ascended these steps, and reached a broad terrace 80 feet high, overlooking the river, and supported by the wall which we had seen from the opposite bank. The whole terrace was covered with trees, and even at this height from the ground were 2 gigantic cebas or wild cotton trees, above 20 feet in circumference, extending their half-naked roots 50 or 100 feet around, binding down the ruins, and shading them with their wide-spreading branches. We sat down on the very edge of the wall, and strove in vain to penetrate the mystery by which we were surrounded. Who were the people that built this city? In the ruined cities of Egypt, even in the long-lost Petra, the stranger knows the story of the people whose vestiges are around him. America, say historians, was peopled by savages, but savages never reared these structures. Savages never carved these stones. We asked the Indians who made them, and their dull answer was Quien sabe? Who knows? There were no associations connected with the place. None of those stirring recollections which hallowed Rome, Athens, and the world's great mistress on the Egyptian plain.
But architecture, sculpture, and painting, all the arts which embellish life, had flourished in this overgrown forest. Orators, warriors, and statesmen, beauty, ambition, and glory, had lived and passed away, and none knew that such things had been or could tell of their past existence. Books, the records of knowledge, are silent on this theme. The city was desolate. No remnant of this race hangs round the ruins, with traditions handed down from father to son, and from generation to generation. It lay before us like a shattered bark in the midst of the ocean, her masts gone, her name effaced, her crew perished, and none to tell whence she came, to whom she belonged, how long on her voyage, or what caused her destruction. Her lost people to be traced only by some fancied resemblance in the construction of the vessel, and perhaps never to be known at all. The place where we sat, was it a citadel from which an unknown people had sounded the trumpet of war? Or a temple for the worship of the god of peace? Or did the inhabitants worship the idols made with their own hands, and offer sacrifices on the stones before them? All was mystery, dark, impenetrable mystery, and every circumstance increased it. In Egypt, the colossal skeletons of gigantic temples stand in the unwatered sands in all the nakedness of desolation. Here an immense forest shrouded the ruins, hiding them from sight, heightening the impression and moral effect, and giving an intensity and almost wildness to the interest. Late in the afternoon we worked our way back to the mules, bathed in the clear river at the foot of the wall, and returned to the hacienda. Our grateful muleteer boy had told of his dreadful illness, and the extraordinary cure effected by Mr. Catherwood, and we found at the hacienda a ghastly-looking man, worn down by fever and ague, who begged us for remedios. An old lady on a visit to the family, who had intended to go home that day, was waiting to be cured of a malady from which she had suffered 20 years. Our medicine chest was brought out, and this converted the wife of the Don into a patient also. Mr. C's reputation rose with the medicines he distributed, and in the course of the evening he had under his hands 4 or 5 women and as many men. We wanted very much to practice on the Don, but he was cautious. The percussion caps of our pistols attracted the attention of the men, and we showed them the compass and other things, which made our friend at San Antonio suppose we were very rich and had many ideas. By degrees we became on social terms with all the house except the master, who found a congenial spirit in the muleteer. He had taken his ground and was too dignified and obstinate to unbend. Our new friends made more room for our hammocks, and we had a better swing for the night. In the morning we continued to astonish the people by our strange ways, particularly by brushing our teeth, an operation which probably they saw then for the first time. While engaged in this, the door of the house opened, and Don Gregorio appeared, turning his head away to avoid giving us a buenos dios, good day. We resolved not to sleep another night under his shed, but to take our hammocks to the ruins, and if there was no building to shelter us, to hang them up under a tree. My contract with the muleteer was to stop 3 days at Copan, but there was no bargain for the use of the mules during that time, and he hoped that the vexations we met with would make us go on immediately. When he found us bent on remaining, he swore he would not carry the hammocks and would not remain 1 day over, but at length consented to hire the mules for that day. Before we started, a new party, who had been conversing some time with Don Gregorio, stepped forward and said that he was the owner of the idols, that no one could go on the land without his permission, and handed me his title papers. This was a new difficulty. I was not disposed to dispute his title, but read his papers as attentively as if I meditated an action in ejectment. And he seemed relieved when I told him his title was good, and that, if not disturbed, I would make him a compliment at parting. Fortunately, he had a favor to ask. Our fame as physicians had reached the village, and he wished remedies for a sick wife. It was important to make him our friend, and after some conversation, it was arranged that Mr. C, with several men whom we had hired, should go on to the ruins as we intended, to make a lodgment there, while I would go to the village and visit his wife.
Our new acquaintance, Don Jose Maria Acevedo, was about 50, tall and well-dressed. That is, his cotton shirt and pantaloons were clean, inoffensive though ignorant, and one of the most respectable inhabitants of Copan. He lived in one of the best huts of the village, made of poles thatched with corn leaves, with a wooden frame on one side for a bed, and furnished with a few pieces of pottery for cooking. A heavy rain had fallen during the night, and the ground inside the hut was wet. His wife seemed as old as he, and fortunately, was suffering from a rheumatism of several years' standing. I say fortunately, but I speak only in reference to ourselves as medical men, and the honored profession accidentally confided to our hands. I told her that if it had been a recent affection, it would be more within the reach of art, but as it was a case of old standing, it required time, skill, watching of symptoms, and the effect of medicine from day to day. And for the present, I advised her take her feet out of a puddle of water in which she was standing, and promised to consult Mr. Catherwood, who was even a better medico than I, and to send her a liniment with which to bathe her neck. This over, Don Jose Maria accompanied me to the ruins, where I found Mr. Catherwood with the Indian workmen. Again we wandered over the whole ground in search of some ruined building in which we could take up our abode, but there was none. To hang up our hammocks under the trees was madness. The branches were still wet, the ground muddy, and again there was a prospect of early rain. But we were determined not to go back to Don Gregorio's. Don Mariano said that there was a hut nearby, and conducted me to it. As we approached, we heard the screams of a woman inside, and entering, saw her rolling and tossing on a bull's-hide bed, wild with fever and pain, and starting to her knees at the sight of me, with her hands pressed against her temples and tears bursting from her eyes, she begged me, for the love of God, to give her some remedios. Her skin was hot, her pulse very high. She had a violent intermitting fever. While inquiring into her symptoms, her husband entered the hut, a white man about 40, dressed in a pair of dirty cotton drawers, with a nether garment hanging outside, a handkerchief tied around his head, and barefooted, and his name was Don Miguel. I told him that we wished to pass a few days among the ruins, and asked permission to stop at his hut. The woman, most happy at having a skillful physician near her, answered for him, and I returned to relieve Mr. Catherwood and add another to his list of patients. The whole party escorted us to the hut, bringing along only the mule that carried the hammocks, and by the addition of Mr. C, to the medical corps, and a mysterious display of drawing materials and measuring rods, the poor woman's fever seemed frightened away. The hut stood on the edge of a clearing, on the ground once covered by the city, with a stone fragment, hollowed out and used as a drinking vessel for cattle, almost at the very door. The clearing was planted with corn and tobacco, and bounded on each side by the forest. The hut was about 16 feet square, with a peaked roof, thatched with husks of Indian corn, made by setting the ground 2 upright poles, with crotches in which another pole was laid to support the peak of the roof, and similar supports on each side, but only about 4 feet high. The gable end was the front, and one half of it was thatched with leaves, while the other remained open. The back part was thatched, and piled up against it was Indian corn 3 ears deep. On one side the pile was unbroken, but on the other it was used down to within 3 or 4 feet of the ground. In the corner in front was the bed of Don Miguel and his wife, protected by a bull's hide fastened at the head and side. The furniture consisted of a stone roller for mashing corn and a comal or earthen griddle for baking tortillas, and on a rude shelf over the bed were 2 boxes, which contained the wardrobe and all the property of Don Miguel and his wife, except Bartolo, their son and heir, an overgrown lad of 20, whose naked body seemed to have burst up out of a pair of boy's trousers, disdaining a shirt, his stomach swollen by a distressing liver complaint, and his livid face clouded with dirt. There was only room enough for 1 hammock, and, in fact, the cross sticks were not strong enough to support 2 men. The pile of corn which had been used down was just high and broad enough for a bed. By consent, I took this for my sleeping place, and Mr. Catherwood hung up his hammock. We were so glad at being relieved from the churlish hospitality of Don Gregorio, and so near the ruins that all seemed snug and comfortable.
After a noonday meal I mounted the luggage mule, with only a halter to hold her, and accompanied by Augustine on foot, set out for Don Gregorio's, for the purpose of bringing over the luggage. The heavy rains had swollen the river, and Augustine was obliged to strip himself in order to ford it. Don Gregorio was not at home, and the muleteer, as usual, glad of a difficulty, said that it was impossible to cross the river with a cargo that day. Regularly, instead of helping us in our little difficulties, he did all that he could to increase them. He knew that if we discharged him, we could get no mules in Copan except by sending off 2 days' journey, that we had no one on whom we could rely to send, and that the delay would be at least a week. Uncertain at what moment it might be advisable to leave, and not wishing to be left destitute, I was compelled to hire him to remain, at a price which was considered so exorbitant that it gave me a reputation for having mucha plata, much money, which, though it might be useful at home, I did not covet at Copan, and afraid to trust me, the rascal stipulated for daily payments. At that time I was not acquainted with the cash system of business prevailing in the country. The barbarians are not satisfied with your custom unless you pay them besides, and the whole or a large portion must be in advance. I was accidentally in arrears to the muleteer, and while I was congratulating myself on this only security for his good behavior, he was torturing himself with the apprehension that I did not mean to pay at all. In the meantime it began to rain, and settling my accounts with the señora, thanking her for her kindness, leaving in order to have some bread baked for the next day, and taking with me an umbrella and a blue bag, contents unknown, belonging to Mr. Catherwood, which he had particularly requested me to bring, I set out on my return. Augustine followed with a tin teapot and some other articles for immediate use. Entering the woods, the umbrella struck against the branches of the trees and frightened the mule, and while I was endeavoring to close it she fairly ran away with me. Having only a halter, I could not hold her, and knocking me against the branches she ran through the woods, splashed into the river, missing the fording place, and never stopped till she was breast deep. The river was swollen and angry, and the rain pouring down. Rapids were foaming a short distance below. In the effort to restrain her, I lost Mr. Catherwood's blue bag, caught at it with the handle of the umbrella, and would have saved it if the beast had stood still, but as it floated under her nose she snorted and started back. I broke the umbrella in driving her across, and just as I touched the shore, saw the bag floating toward the rapids and Augustine with his clothes in one hand and the teapot in the other, both above his head, steering down the river after it. supposing it to contain some indispensable drawing materials. I dashed among the thickets on the bank in the hope of intercepting it, but became entangled among branches and vines. I dismounted and tied my mule, and was 2 or 3 minutes working my way to the river, where I saw Augustine's clothes in the teapot, but nothing of him, and with the rapids roaring below had horrible apprehensions. It was impossible to continue along the bank, so with a violent effort, I jumped across a rapid channel to a ragged island of sand covered with scrub bushes, and running down to the end of it, saw the whole face of the river and the rapids, but nothing of Augustine. I shouted with all my strength, and to my inexpressible relief heard an answer, but in the noise of the rapids very faint. Presently he appeared in the water, working himself around a point and hauling upon the bushes. Believed about him, I now found myself in a quandary. The jump back was to higher ground, the stream a torrent, and the excitement over, I was afraid to attempt it. It would have been exceedingly inconvenient for me if Augustine had been drowned. Making his way through the bushes and down to the bank opposite with his dripping body, he stretched a pole across the stream, by springing upon which I touched the edge of the bank, slipped, but hauled myself up by the bushes with the aid of a lift from Augustine. All this time it was raining very hard, and now I had forgotten where I tied my mule. We were several minutes looking for her, and wishing everything but good luck to the old bag I mounted. Augustine, principally because he could carry them more conveniently on his back, put on his clothes.
Reaching the village, I took shelter in the hut of Don Jose Maria, while Augustine, being in a happy state that cannot be made worse, continued through the rain, and the moment abetted I followed. I had another stream to cross, which was also much swollen, and the road was flooded. The road lay through a thick forest. Very soon the clouds became blacker than ever. On the left was a range of naked mountains, the old stone quarries of Copan, along which the thunder rolled fearfully, and the lightning wrote angry inscriptions on its sides. An English tourist in the United States admits the superiority of our thunder and lightning. I am pertinacious on all points of national honor, but concede this in favor of the tropics. The rain fell as if floodgates were opened from above, and while my mule was slipping and sliding to the mud, I lost my road. I returned some distance, and was again retracing my steps, when I met a woman barefooted and holding her dress above her knees, who proved to be my rheumatic patient, the wife of Don Jose Maria. While inquiring the road, I told her that she was setting at naught the skill of the physician, and added, what I believed to be very true, that she need not expect to get well under our treatment. I rode on some distance, and again lost my way. It was necessary to enter the woods on the right. I had come out by a footpath, which I had not noticed particularly. There were cattle paths in every direction, and within a line of a mile I kept going in and out without hitting the right one. Several times I saw the prints of Augustine's feet, but soon lost them in puddles of water, and they only confused me more. At length I came to a complete standstill. It was nearly dark. I did not know which way to turn, and as Mr. Henry Pelham did, when in danger of drowning in one of the gutters of Paris, I stood still and hallooed. To my great joy, I was answered by a roar from Augustine, who had been lost longer than I, and was in even greater tribulation. He had the teapot in his hand, the stump of an unlighted cigar in his mouth, was plastered with mud from his head to his heels, and altogether a most distressful object. We compared notes, and, selecting a path, shouting as we went, our united voices were answered by the barking of dogs and Mr. Catherwood, who, alarmed at our absence, and apprehending what had happened, was coming out with Don Miguel to look for us. All the evening peals of thunder crashed over our heads. Lightning illuminated the dark forest and flashed through the open hut. The rain fell in torrents, and Don Miguel said that there was a prospect of being cut off for several days from all communication with the opposite side of the river and from our luggage. Nevertheless, we passed the evening with great satisfaction, smoking cigars of Copan tobacco, the most famed in Central America, of Don Miguel's own growing and his wife's own making. Don Miguel, like myself that evening, had but little wearing apparel, but he was an intelligent and educated man, could read and write, bleed and draw teeth or a law paper, literary in his tastes, for he asked Augustine if we had any books. He said there being English made no difference. Books were good things, and it was delightful to hear him express a contempt for the understanding of Don Gregorio. He was a subtenant on the estate, at a rent of $4 a year, and was generally behindhand in his payments. He said he had not much to offer us, but we felt what was better than a canopied bed, that we were welcome guests. In fact, all were pleased. His wife expected us to drive away her fever and ague. Bartolo made sure that we would reduce the protuberance of his stomach, and Don Miguel liked our society. In these happy circumstances, the raging of the elements without did not disturb us. All day I had been brooding over the title deeds of Don Jose Maria, and, drawing my blanket around me, suggested to Mr. Catherwood an operation. Hide your heads, ye speculators in building lots. To buy Copan, remove the monument of a bygone people from the desolate region in which they were buried, set them up in the great commercial emporium, and found an institution to be the nucleus of a great national museum of American antiquities. But queer, could the idols be removed? They were on the banks of a river that emptied into the same ocean by which the docks of New York are washed, but there were rapids below, and in answer to my inquiry, Don Miguel said these were impassable. Nevertheless, I should have been unworthy of having originated so bright an idea if I had not had an alternative, and this was to exhibit by sample, to cut one up and remove it in pieces, and make casts of the rest. Other ruins might be discovered even more interesting and more accessible, and so, with visions of glory and indistinct fancies of receiving the thanks of the corporation flitting before my eyes, I drew my blanket around me and fell asleep.